In the summer of 1947, as the Indian subcontinent tore itself apart in one of the worst spasms of sectarian violence in modern history, a 45-year-old British countess waded into refugee camps reeking of cholera and burning flesh. She had inherited one of the largest fortunes in Europe, wore couture gowns, and had spent the previous 2 decades being passed between lovers in country houses and Parisian hotel rooms. Now, somehow, she was kneeling in dust beside dying children while her husband redrew the map of Asia and her closest confidant, the future Prime Minister of India, watched her from across the lawn of the viceregal palace. How did the most scandalous society wife of interwar Britain end up at the moral center of the end of empire? And why 6 decades after her death are historians still arguing about whether she was a saint, a hypocrite, or something far stranger and more contradictory than either label allows? Join me to find out. Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley was born on the 28th of November 1901 at Broadlands, a Palladian country house in Hampshire that had once belonged to the Victorian statesman Lord Palmerston. The house itself tells you something about the family she entered. It was old and grand, but it had been bought rather than inherited, purchased by her grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassel, a German Jewish financier who had clawed his way from a clerk's stool in Cologne to the highest reaches of Edwardian finance. Cassel was the personal banker of King Edward VII, and by the time of his granddaughter's birth, he was one of the wealthiest men in the British Empire. Her father, Wilfrid Ashley, came from a more conventional aristocratic line, eventually becoming a Conservative Member of Parliament and being elevated to the peerage as Baron Mount Temple. Maud Cassel, her mother, was Sir Ernest's only child and the conduit through which the Cassel fortune would eventually flow. Maud died of tuberculosis in 1911, when Edwina was 9. The loss of a mother at that age shaped the rest of Edwina's emotional life in ways biographers have spent decades trying to untangle, and her relationship with her stepmother, Muriel Forbes Sempill, was reportedly cold and at times openly hostile. By the time of Sir Ernest's death in 1921, Edwina, then aged 19, found herself the principal heir to an estate valued at well over £7.5 million, a sum so vast it placed her among the richest unmarried women in Europe. The figure's worth pausing on. Adjusted for inflation and asset appreciation, her inheritance would today represent hundreds of millions of pounds, and most heiresses of her era inherited a country house, perhaps a London residence, and an income of some kind. Edwina inherited a financial empire. With it came the freedom to live exactly as she wished, answerable to almost no one. To understand the woman Edwina became, one has to picture the strange childhood that produced her. After Maud's death, Sir Ernest Cassel took an active interest in his granddaughter's upbringing, and she spent long stretches at his enormous London townhouse at Brook House on Park Lane. That house had a marble staircase wide enough for a horse, an art collection that rivaled small museums, and a staff of dozens. It was also largely silent. Cassel was a widower, an introvert, and a man of business, while the child who wandered those corridors was clever, watchful, and intensely lonely. Her schooling was patchy by the standards of her class. She attended a finishing school called the Links in Eastbourne and another called Alday House, but she was not formally educated to any rigorous standard. What she absorbed instead was a kind of tutelage in money and power. Cassel's dinner table was attended by cabinet ministers, foreign ambassadors, and members of the royal family. By the time she was a teenager, Edwina had met more politically consequential men than most women of her era would meet in a lifetime, and this shaped her in 2 contradictory ways. It gave her a precocious confidence in dealing with powerful people, but it also gave her a lifelong contempt for the small social rituals that ordinary aristocratic women were expected to find fulfilling. She came out as a debutante in 1920, the year of her 18th birthday, and threw herself into the post-war London social whirl with an appetite that surprised her father.
The first inklings of the woman she would become were already visible.
She drank, smoked, and stayed out until dawn at the Embassy Club and the Café de Paris, conducting at least 2 minor flirtations before she met the man who would change her life entirely. She met Lord Louis Mountbatten in October 1920 at a ball at Claridge's. He was 20, she was almost 19, and he was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a serving naval officer, the son of Prince Louis of Battenberg, and a man of charm, ambition, and very little money. The Battenbergs had been forced to anglicize their name during the First World War, and had spent the conflict watching the family's standing crumble under the weight of anti-German hysteria. Louis had inherited his father's wounded pride and a determination to restore the family name through naval distinction and a brilliant marriage. He found both in Edwina. Their courtship played out across Europe and India, where Louis was serving as aide-de-camp to the Prince of Wales during a royal tour. Edwina, with her grandfather's fortune now hers to command, simply sailed to Delhi to be near him. They became engaged at the Viceroy's house in February 1922 and married in London on the 18th of July of that year. The wedding was the social event of the season. The Prince of Wales, soon to be Edward VIII, served as best man. The bride wore a gown by Reville and a tiara of diamonds, and newsreels recorded the crowds outside St. Margaret's, Westminster. What the newsreels could not record was that the marriage, almost from the beginning, was structurally unstable. Louis was charming, ambitious, and self-absorbed. According to multiple biographers and the testimony of his own daughter Pamela, he was also a man of complicated and contested sexual interests. Edwina was restless, brilliant, and emotionally famished from a childhood of emotional withdrawal.
She had married a man who could not give her what she needed, and she had the money to look for it elsewhere.
By the late 1920s, the cracks in this picture were unmistakable. Their daughter, Patricia, had been born in 1924, and Pamela followed in 1929. But the births of the children only seemed to deepen Edwina's sense of suffocation. At 28 years old, married to a man who was often at sea, in possession of a fortune large enough to buy a small country, she found herself entirely without anything resembling a purpose. What followed was nearly a decade of behavior that scandalized even the permissive London society in which she moved. Edwina's interwar affairs were not whispered indiscretions.
They were front-page operation.
Her name was linked with varying degrees of corroboration to a roster of men that included Lord Hugh Molyneux, the future Earl of Sefton, Stephen Laddie Sanford, a wealthy American polo player, Larry Gray, a Hollywood actor, and Captain Mike Wardell, a press lieutenant of Lord Beaverbrook. Most biographers consider these affairs documented to a high standard of confidence, drawing on letters, society diaries, and the recollections of her contemporaries. The most consequential of her lovers, however, was a man whose name has largely faded from public memory. Colonel Harold Bunny Phillips was a Coldstream Guards officer, handsome, athletic, and possessed of the kind of unflappable charm that allowed him to navigate situations most men would have found impossible. The Phillips affair began in the early 1930s and lasted years. What made it extraordinary was not its duration, but its arrangement. Louis Mountbatten did not merely tolerate Phillips. He befriended him, holidayed with him, and appeared together with the two of them at social functions, the three of them living together for stretches at a time. Photographs survive of the trio on yachts and at country weekends, and the smiles in those photographs are not performed. By all accounts, the arrangement worked. To call this an open marriage is technically accurate, but somewhat understates the strangeness of what the Mountbattens had constructed. They had, in effect, built a domestic life that was less a marriage than a complicated three-cornered partnership held together by Louis's tolerance, Edwina's infatuation, and Phillips's remarkable ability to be charming to everyone involved. There were also persistent rumors. According to declassified MI5 files, and the diaries of various society women that Edwina conducted affairs with women as well as men. These rumors are harder to verify than her relationships with men, and most modern biographers treat them as probable but not definitively documented. What is documented is that British domestic intelligence took an interest in her, partly because of her associations with left-wing artists and writers, and partly because of the sheer unpredictability of her social life. It is worth pausing to consider what daily life inside this marriage looked like. Edwina kept her own household accounts and her own correspondence. She traveled when she pleased and to whom she pleased. Louis, when he was not at sea, occupied his own social orbit with his own attachments, while the children, as we shall soon see, were left to navigate this world largely without their mother's attention. From the outside, the Mountbattens had constructed something that resembled a marriage, but internally it functioned as something closer to a corporate alliance with romantic privileges granted to both parties. In July 1932, the Sunday newspaper The People published an article that nearly destroyed Edwina's reputation. The piece, written in the coded language of interwar gossip journalism, alleged that a prominent society woman was conducting an affair with a colored man. The implication was unmistakable, and the attack was designed to humiliate. Press and public almost immediately fixed on Paul Robeson, the African-American singer and actor who had been performing in London. Robeson was a celebrity. He was black, and he had been seen at events Edwina had attended, all of which lent the rumor an air of plausibility that alarmed Buckingham Palace. King George V, who took an exceedingly dim view of any scandal that touched the orbit of the royal family, summoned the Mountbattens back to London from a holiday abroad and instructed them to sue.
They did. The libel case, handled by the formidable barrister Norman Burkitt, was a public spectacle.
Edwina swore on oath that she had never met Paul Robeson. The newspaper had no evidence to the contrary, and the Mountbattens won damages. The article was retracted, and the immediate scandal subsided. The legal victory, however, papered over a much more uncomfortable truth. According to the critical biographer Andrew Lownie, who reconstructed the episode from society diaries and archival sources in his 2019 book, Edwina was almost certainly conducting an affair at the time, but not with Paul Robeson. Her actual lover was Leslie Hutchinson, a Grenadian cabaret singer known throughout Mayfair as Hutch, whose smooth tenor and devastating good looks had made him one of the most fashionable performers in London. He played the piano at private parties, sang at supper clubs, and conducted, by general report, simultaneous affairs with a remarkable number of titled women. The Hutch affair, then, was the secret beneath the libel case. The Mountbattens had won their lawsuit on a technicality of identity. They had not been libeled in the precise sense of the word, though they had hardly been wronged in spirit either. Some accounts of the Hutch relationship include lurid claims about extravagant gifts, including a Cartier sheath of allegedly intimate purpose. These details have circulated in society memoirs for decades, but have never been substantiated by any photograph, receipt, or archival document, and any rigorous biographer must classify them as gossip rather than fact. What is certain is that the libel case bought the Mountbattens a reputation for legal aggression that protected them from further direct press attacks for the rest of the decade. The cost of that protection was a public lie, sworn under oath, by a woman who would later be celebrated as a humanitarian icon. Of all the stories about Edwina's failures as a mother, none is more frequently cited than the incident at the Hungarian hotel. The basic facts, as recorded in the memoirs of her younger daughter Pamela, are these. In the summer of 1933, Edwina took her two children, Patricia and Pamela, on a continental holiday. At a mountain hotel somewhere in Hungary, she deposited the girls and their nanny, kissed them goodbye, and departed for an unspecified period of time with one of her lovers. The children remained at the hotel, their nanny continued to look after them, and when Edwina returned, she behaved as if nothing unusual had occurred. Some retellings of this episode have inflated it into a tale of total abandonment, with Edwina supposedly forgetting the address of the hotel and leaving the children stranded for months. Pamela's own account is more measured. The abandonment was brief, the children were in safe hands, and the nanny was capable. What the episode reveals, however, is not the precise duration of her absence, but the pattern of which it was a particularly vivid example. Edwina did not regard her children as central to her life. She regarded them as a logistical responsibility that could be delegated. Pamela Hicks, in her later memoirs, described feeling like a nuisance to her mother throughout her childhood. She wrote that Edwina only began to take a real interest in her daughters when they reached an age at which they could be useful, which is to say when they could serve as social aides, secretaries, or companions during her travels. Patricia, the elder daughter, has been more publicly diplomatic about her mother in her own writings, but the picture that emerges from both daughters' accounts is consistent. Edwina was a distant figure who appeared in the children's lives between affairs and disappeared between holidays. It is worth saying clearly that this kind of maternal absenteeism was not particularly unusual among aristocratic women of her era. Children of the British upper classes were routinely raised by nannies, governesses, and boarding school staff, and for most aristocratic mothers, the rhythm of intermittent attention was the default rather than the exception. What set Edwina apart was the intensity of her absence and the frequency with which her departures were not for any social or familial purpose, but simply for the pursuit of her own emotional and sexual life. Her contemporaries noticed, her staff noticed, her children decades later were still writing about it. The mid-1930s were, by every account, the unhappiest period of Edwina's life. Her depressions, which she called her nerves, became severe enough to alarm her family and her physicians. She would withdraw to her bedroom for days at a time, picking fights with Louis that ended in screaming and broken china. Louis, in his private diaries, recorded her outbursts with a mixture of bafflement and resignation, noting her cruelty and her impossibility, and observing in moments of unusual frankness that he could not understand why a woman with so much should be so consistently miserable. Modern readers, with the benefit of a century of psychological vocabulary, would likely describe what Edwina suffered as a combination of clinical depression, anxiety, and the consequences of severe early life loss. In her own era, no such vocabulary existed. She was a difficult, unhappy woman, and the diagnoses available to her were limited to exhaustion, nerves, and the vaguer categorizations of feminine instability that her doctors fell back on when more specific language failed them. What is striking, reading her letters from this period, is the self-awareness. Edwina knew she was unhappy. She knew she was cruel to her husband, and she knew her behavior with her lovers was not bringing her the satisfaction she sought. In passages that survive in the Broadlands archive, she wrote of her own restlessness as a kind of curse, and the diagnosis she gave herself was one of pointlessness. She had everything money could provide, and she could not find anything that resembled meaning. This was the woman who, when the Second World War broke out in September 1939, finally found a use for her energies that her interwar life had denied her. The transformation that occurred in Edwina Mountbatten between 1939 and 1945 is one of the most remarkable personal reinventions of the 20th century. The bored, depressive, sexually voracious socialite of the 1930s threw herself into the war effort with an intensity that astonished even her closest friends. She joined the St. John Ambulance Brigade, rose rapidly through its ranks, and by 1942 had been appointed Superintendent-in-Chief, a position that gave her direct authority over thousands of nurses and welfare workers across the British Empire. What she did with that authority forms the basis of her later reputation. She toured, she inspected, she turned up unannounced at field hospitals in Burma, at evacuee camps in East Africa, at prisoner-of-war reception centers across Southeast Asia, and her ability to bypass military bureaucracy and demand answers from senior officers earned her the nickname the Bulldozer. General Slim, who commanded the 14th Army in Burma, reportedly grumbled about her interventions, but conceded that she got things done. Personal physical courage came as a surprise to many who had only known her as a society figure. She walked through cholera wards, visiting liberated Japanese prisoner-of-war camps within days of their being opened, and witnessing scenes that broke harder constitutions than hers. She ate the same rations as the nurses she inspected, slept on the same camp beds, and wrote her own reports rather than delegating them to subordinates. Her reports were specific, detailed, and consistently aimed at securing more resources for the people on the ground. The question of what changed in her is harder to answer. Some biographers have suggested that the war finally gave her a stage commensurate with her energies. Others have argued that she had always possessed these capacities, and that the frivolity of her interwar life had been a symptom of their suppression. A more critical reading, advanced most forcefully by Lownie, suggests that the same restless need for attention that had driven her affairs now drove her humanitarianism, and that the moral content of her wartime work, real as it was inseparable from her need to be the central figure in any room she entered. Whatever the psychological mechanism, the practical results were undeniable. By the end of the war, Edwina Mountbatten was no longer primarily known as a society scandal. People knew her as a woman who had spent 6 years working herself to exhaustion in service of soldiers, refugees, and the wounded. The transformation was real, even if, as we shall soon see, the contradictions of her earlier life never entirely disappeared. Louis Mountbatten emerged from the war with a reputation as a successful Allied commander, having served as Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command. In December 1946, the Labour government of Clement Attlee approached him with what would prove to be the most consequential and contentious assignment of his career. He was to be the last Viceroy of India, sent to oversee the British withdrawal from a subcontinent that was already convulsing with sectarian violence and political collapse. He accepted, on conditions that included his own choice of staff and an explicit timetable for British departure.
Edwina accompanied him. At 45 years old, exhausted from the war, she was not particularly enthusiastic about the assignment.
Pamela, their younger daughter, then 17, came with them, while Patricia, by then married, remained in England. The Mountbattens arrived in Delhi in March 1947. Within weeks, Edwina had thrown herself into a punishing schedule of camp visits, hospital tours, and meetings with Indian welfare organizations. Within months, she had met Jawaharlal Nehru, the leader of the Indian National Congress and the man who would shortly become independent India's first prime minister. By the time of Indian independence on the 15th of August, 1947, the relationship between Edwina and Nehru had become the most discussed and most consequential personal entanglement of the entire transfer of power. Nehru and Edwina had actually met briefly the previous year, in Singapore in 1946, but their real intimacy began in Delhi in 1947. He was 57, a widower since 1936, intellectually formidable, romantically lonely, and almost as exhausted as she was. She was 45, beautiful, intelligent, and after years of empty affairs, ready for something that resembled a genuine emotional connection. They recognized each other almost immediately. What followed has been the subject of biographical argument for 60 years. The basic facts are not in dispute. They wrote each other long, affectionate, intellectually substantial letters that continued from 1947 until Edwina's death in 1960. They spent extended periods of time together, both in India and during her later visits to the country. Louis Mountbatten was aware of the relationship, raised no objection, and indeed seems to have regarded Nehru with genuine respect and even affection. Pamela, the daughter, lived through the Delhi summer of 1947 and saw the two of them together daily. The argument is over the physical nature of the relationship. Pamela Hicks, in her 2007 memoir, defended her mother's relationship with Nehru as essentially spiritual rather than sexual. Her argument was practical. The viceregal palace was filled with staff, security personnel, and aides, leaving no privacy for any clandestine arrangement, and the chaotic conditions of partition would have made any physical affair logistically impossible. Andrew Lownie, taking the opposing view, argues that Edwina's well-documented sexual history makes a non-physical relationship implausible, and that the surviving letters, even in their censored form, contain language that suggests intimacy beyond the platonic. The matter cannot be definitively resolved, because the most intimate of the surviving letters have been heavily restricted by both the Mountbatten and Nehru-Gandhi families. The Broadlands Archive at the University of Southampton holds a substantial collection of correspondence, but access to the most personal material remains controlled. Future scholars may yet have a clearer picture, though for now the only honest answer is that the question is open, and that anyone who claims certainty is overreading the evidence in one direction or the other. What is undeniable, regardless of physical specifics, is that the relationship had political consequences. Edwina was the wife of the viceroy. In effect, she was Britain's representative consort during the most delicate negotiation in the history of the British Empire, and her closest emotional confidant was the leader of one of the two parties to that negotiation. Whatever the moral status of the relationship, its political optics were impossible to defend. The partition of India in August 1947 produced one of the largest forced migrations in human history and one of the bloodiest sectarian massacres of the 20th century. Estimates of the death toll vary between 1 million and 2 million people, while the number of displaced persons is generally given as somewhere between 14 and 18 million. Trains arrived at stations across the new borders carrying nothing but corpses. Villages were burned. Women were abducted in numbers that subsequent governments have spent decades attempting to document, and the violence overran all attempts at containment. Louis Mountbatten's role in this catastrophe has been debated by historians for 70 years. He had accelerated the British withdrawal timetable, moving the date of independence forward from June 1948 to August 1947. He had appointed Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer with no prior knowledge of India, to draw the partition borders in a matter of weeks. Mountbatten had also failed to provide adequate military protection for the population movements that everyone knew would follow. The accelerated timetable, the ill-prepared border, and the inadequate security combined to produce the conditions in which the violence exploded. Edwina's role during this catastrophe was different from her husband's, and it is here that the most sympathetic and the most critical readings of her diverge most sharply. While Louis was managing the political mechanics of the transfer of power, Edwina was in the camps. She visited refugee camps housing tens of thousands of displaced people, personally inspected medical facilities, demanded supplies, and organized volunteer labor, using her viceregal authority to override bureaucratic obstacles that would have stopped less determined people. She pushed her way into hospitals and supply depots that ordinary officials could not have entered. Contemporary medical personnel who worked alongside her recorded their admiration without reservation. She was tireless. Walking through neighborhoods that had been the sites of massacres only days earlier, she held dying children, wrote reports that named names, and demanded action. The St. John ambulance personnel who served under her later recalled her conduct during partition as the most extraordinary leadership they had ever witnessed. The critical reading of this period, advanced most forcefully by post-colonial historians and by Lownie, does not deny her physical courage or the practical effectiveness of her humanitarian work. It argues, rather, that her highly visible humanitarianism functioned, intentionally or not, as a public relations shield for her husband's political failures. Cameras followed her into the camps. Newspapers ran photographs of her tending to the wounded, and while she was performing these acts of genuine humanitarian service, The institutional blame for the catastrophe was being deflected away from the political decisions that had produced it.
This is a difficult charge to evaluate. Edwina did not, by any account, set out to provide cover for her husband's mistakes.
Her humanitarian work was real, sustained, and personally costly, but at the same time, the optical effect of that work was undeniably to humanize the British presence at precisely the moment when British political decisions were proving catastrophic. Whether one regards this as a fortunate coincidence or as a structural function of imperial public relations probably depends on one's broader view of the end of empire. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan and the leader of the Muslim League, did not like the Mountbattens. He had reasons. He believed, with considerable justification, that the Viceregal Lodge in Delhi had become a social and political annex of the Indian National Congress. The constant presence of Nehru at viceregal functions, the obvious warmth between Nehru and Edwina, the apparent ease with which Congress leaders moved through the corridors of British power, all of this confirmed Jinnah's suspicion that the British transfer of authority was being conducted in a manner systematically prejudicial to Muslim interests. Whether that suspicion was correct is a more complicated question than political polemicists in either direction tend to allow. The drawing of the Radcliffe Line, the actual physical border between India and Pakistan, was the work of Cyril Radcliffe and his commission, who were kept deliberately isolated from political pressure during their deliberations. Allegations that Edwina personally influenced the placement of the border are without documentary support and are rejected by serious historians of the partition. The border was unjust in several respects, particularly in the Punjab, but its injustices were the product of Radcliffe's haste and inadequate information, rather than of viceregal interference. The Kashmir question is somewhat different. The Maharaja of Kashmir, a Hindu ruler over a Muslim-majority population, dithered for months over whether to accede to India or Pakistan or to attempt independence. Louis Mountbatten initially advised the Maharaja that he should consider acceding to Pakistan if his population's preferences pointed in that direction. When tribal forces from Pakistan invaded Kashmir in October 1947, the Maharaja signed the Instrument of Accession to India, and Indian troops were dispatched to defend Srinagar. The result was the First Indo-Pakistani War and a territorial dispute that has poisoned South Asian politics for almost 80 years. Critics have argued that Edwina's emotional alliance with Nehru blinded Louis to Pakistani concerns and tilted British viceregal advice in directions that ultimately favored India. The documentary evidence for this claim is thinner than its proponents tend to admit. Mountbatten's actual conduct during the Kashmir crisis was complex, sometimes contradictory, and not consistently pro-Indian. What is fair to say is that the public perception of viceregal bias was real, that it damaged the credibility of British neutrality during the partition negotiations, and that Edwina's relationship with Nehru contributed materially to that perception. Whether or not her influence was substantively decisive on any specific political question, its optical effect on the Muslim League's willingness to trust British arbitration was deeply corrosive. One of the more curious aspects of Edwina Mountbatten's later life was her flirtation with socialist politics. From the mid-1930s onwards, she increasingly described herself in left-wing terms. She voted Labour, supported progressive causes, attended dinners with left-wing intellectuals, and corresponded with figures like Harold Laski. In London society, people referred to her as the Pink Countess, or more pointedly, the Bolshie Countess. The contradictions between this political self-presentation and her actual life were so glaring that even her sympathetic biographers have struggled to reconcile them. She was the heiress to the Cassel fortune. Her residences alternated between Broadlands, Brooke House, and various continental retreats, and she employed a domestic staff that ran into the dozens. treating them with a mixture of patrician courtesy and exacting demands that would have raised eyebrows in any genuinely socialist household. More damning, the financial records of the Mountbatten estate reveal sustained and sophisticated efforts to shield the Cassel fortune from the post-war Labour government's punitive taxation regime. Established with the assistance of expensive legal advisors, the Broadlands Trust channeled the family's wealth through structures designed to minimize estate duty and income tax. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was the deliberate, considered strategy of a family that publicly endorsed the political project of redistribution while privately doing everything legally possible to ensure that their own wealth was not redistributed. Sympathetic biographers have argued that this was simply the standard behavior of any wealthy family of the era, and that Edwina's progressive political instincts, however imperfectly applied, were genuine. Critical biographers have pointed out, with some justice, that the test of political conviction is what one is willing to give up rather than what one is willing to vote for. By that test, the Bolshie countess fails the examination. She was happy to support a political program that promised to tax wealth like hers. She was equally happy to ensure that her own wealth was not in fact taxed in the manner that program proposed. It is difficult to read this aspect of her life without concluding that her socialism was, at least in part, a fashion. Distinguishing herself from the more conventionally conservative women of her class allowed her to associate with the artists and intellectuals she admired, and gave her humanitarian instincts a political vocabulary they would otherwise have lacked. In any meaningful operational sense, however, it was not a willingness to live differently from how she had always lived. After the Mountbattens returned to England in 1948, Edwina continued her humanitarian work with the St. John Ambulance Brigade and the Save the Children Fund. She traveled relentlessly, visiting refugee camps in the Middle East, hospitals in Africa, and welfare organizations across Asia. By the standards of any working professional, her schedule was inhuman. By the standards of an aristocratic woman in her 50s, it was simply baffling. Her correspondence with Nehru continued throughout this period. They saw each other when she traveled to India, which she did repeatedly, and the letters they exchanged in the years between visits sustained what was by now the central emotional relationship of her life. Louis, increasingly absorbed by his own naval and political career, accepted this with the same equanimity he had shown to all of Edwina's previous attachments. The Mountbatten marriage had survived for so long on such unconventional terms that the addition of one more deeply held attachment scarcely altered its structural arithmetic. Her health, however, was failing. Years of overwork, irregular sleep, poor diet during her travels, and the cumulative strain of her depressive episodes had taken a toll that by the late 1950s was visible to anyone who saw her. Thin and drawn, she was increasingly prone to exhaustion. Doctors warned her repeatedly to rest. She ignored them. In February 1960, she traveled to North Borneo on an inspection tour for the St. John Ambulance Brigade. She was 58 years old. Her physicians had told her that the trip would be too strenuous for her and that she should postpone it, but she refused. On the night of the 20th of February 1960, she went to bed in her quarters at the government house in Jesselton, North Borneo. Found dead the following morning, having died in her sleep of what was officially recorded as a cardiac event, she was discovered with letters from Nehru beside her on the bedside table. She was buried at sea on the 25th of February 1960 from the British frigate HMS Wakeful in accordance with her own expressed wish. The Indian frigate Innistrishal accompanied the British vessel with Nehru's arrangement and laid a wreath of marigolds on the water. It was a final gesture of acknowledgement from the man whose presence in her life had defined its last decade. The reputation of Edwina Mountbatten has gone through several distinct phases since her death. In the immediate aftermath, the dominant narrative was hagiographic. People remembered her as the great humanitarian, the wartime bulldozer, the woman who had walked through cholera wards and refugee camps in service of those whom history was crushing. Official biographies of this period, including Hough's 1980 study and Janet Morgan's authorized 1991 life, preserved this image with care, contextualizing her infidelities as the symptoms of a brilliant, restless mind and her political controversies as the consequence of a uniquely turbulent historical moment. A more critical reassessment began to emerge in the early 21st century, as archival access expanded and as post-colonial scholarship began to examine the end of empire with more skeptical eyes. Alex von Tunzelmann's Indian Summer in 2007 placed the Nehru relationship within the broader political machinery of partition and asked harder questions about its consequences. Andrew Lownie's 2019 study, drawing on declassified intelligence files and society diaries that had only recently become available, painted the most unflinching portrait of the Mountbattens' private lives that has yet appeared in print, and it left Edwina's reputation as a saintly humanitarian considerably reduced. The challenge for any honest assessment is that both readings contain genuine truth. Edwina was an emotionally destructive partner and a frequently absent mother. She was also a humanitarian whose practical achievements during partition and afterwards saved an unknowable number of lives. As a hypocrite, her socialist politics never extended to a willingness to give up her own wealth. Yet she was also a woman who used that wealth repeatedly and at considerable personal cost to fund and support causes she believed in. Her closeness to Nehru damaged British credibility during the most consequential negotiation of the 20th century, but, by every account of those who worked beside her, she was also one of the bravest women of her era. The temptation to flatten these contradictions into a single judgment is strong. It is also, in this case, mistaken. Edwina Mountbatten was not a saint, and she was not a fraud. Privilege, in her case, was used in ways that were sometimes admirable, sometimes appalling, and frequently both at once. The historical record is now sufficiently developed to allow us to see her clearly, and seeing her clearly means accepting that the same restless, narcissistic, demanding personality that produced the affairs and the neglected children also produced the wartime tours and the partition camps.
Broadland still stands. The house her grandfather purchased and where she was born is now operated as a private estate by her descendants.
Archives at the University of Southampton continue to release material, slowly, as the families involved permit, and the letters between Edwina and Nehru, the most personal of which remain restricted, will eventually become available to scholars. When they do, the picture may sharpen further. What we have for now is a figure of profound contradictions, one whose biography illustrates how completely the public and private lives of the powerful can intersect, and how impossible it is to separate the achievements of such a life from the costs at which those achievements were purchased.